Okay,
We're live.
yeah, that's recording now. Okay, cool. So this is the Axiom of the Infinite Unknown. Hopefully, episode 2 if we release this. I'm
Yeah.
James Valaitis, and you're
Ciaran the Quarrelsome O Regan.
okay. Brilliant. And and today we want to talk about well, a very interesting man named Daniel Schmachtenberger has recently featured, and we won't say recorded because these were recorded prior to one of them prior to the coronavirus, and another within the range of knowing about the coronavirus, but still, in terms of timeline, everything's so accelerated that much of what he talked about had to necessarily be a bit more abstract. So his name is Daniel Schmachtenberger, and he was a guest on episode 27, I believe, of the Portal, and in a recent video on a channel called Rebel Wisdom. And we both just agreed that he's one of the great minds of our generation. And we want to discuss some of his ideas. And we wanted to kick off with his notion of a protopia, which, as I was just explaining to Kieran, in my mind, is a very clever way of skirting the problems with a utopia as it has been come to be known, because we recognize now that striving for a utopia and expecting it to happen often realizes a dystopia that we wouldn't want. And so this protopia nods to that realization that utopias are probably impossible, but we've got a lot further to go. But like we're not currently set in the position where we're maximizing all that we can get out of human prosperity and well-being. And so, do you want to kick off, Kieran?
Yeah, first of all, I suppose I only heard him talk about this in one occasion, and that was in that particular episode with Weinstein that we listened to recently, or Weinstein or Weinstein. I can't remember which one.
Stein.
Weinstein. Yeah.
Yeah, Einstein, Weinstein.
Oh, that's easy to remember.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm going to be able to do the best job of steel manning his arguments by any means. So, but what I think would be a fascinating thing to discuss is, I think I have kind of a grasp of what excited me is that I have kind of a grasp based on that interview of the way he's kind of thinking, and it's a big, giant, juicy bit of confirmation bias for a way that I've been thinking for a while as well.
It speaks to something recently written about by Chris Ryan, right? Civilized to Death. Is that his name, Chris Ryan?
Yeah.
Very much nods to that in as much as Daniel Schmachtenberger explicitly talks about the need for a natural reduction in population. And this is completely antithetical to some of the most revered economic thinkers like Friedrich August von Hayek. Hayek, in particular, wrote an entire book, The Fatal Conceit, in which an important argument was the growth of the population enables the prosperity of man because it allows for a diversity of humans, which necessitate, which is necessitated by a extremely complex and thriving economy. And so therefore the two go hand in hand. Large population, thriving economy, and the thriving economy needs the large population. The large population needs the thriving economy, and it's a cycle. And this almost this is a recognition that, or at least a theory that can't continue indefinitely, and we have to figure out a game B, as they call it, a different way of living, which no longer requires this cycle. So if you wanna take
I
that.
really like that. I didn't actually know that about Hayek. That's an interesting addition because it's actually the population thing I find interesting but I don't really know much about that. I don't really know much about the specific, very little about the specific limitations of this planet to support what X number of people in a way that would be unsustainable. So I don't really know. So I don't really know about in terms of that side of his argument. I actually it didn't really bite me so much. What the part of his points in relation to that I did find interesting was just that with increasing education, particularly of women, there would be a natural reduction in population growth anyway, as has been evidenced across developed nations.
This was very strong argument that the great Christopher Hitchens used to make about effectively why it was that Mother Teresa was an antichrist rather than the saint she was purported to be, because she did exactly that which you would want to do if you wanted to keep a population suppressed, which is to say she outright advised against the use of any reproductive what do I want to say, condoms and things like this.
Yeah.
What's the word for that again? I've already birth control. She restricted the use of any birth control, at least under her advice, and she kept women basically underpowered. So that was his argument for why actually she worked against what she was purportedly doing, because the best thing you can do is empower the females with things like birth control to then enable them to thrive and live as equal human beings.
In terms of their ability to generate, to work and to partake in the workforce, and then to have a sense of autonomy independent of male providers.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I found that particularly interesting because he wasn't talking about taking when whatever his points were, whatever data he's using to justify the idea of decreasing the population. I'm actually I don't remember they go into that in detail, and it's not something that I'd actually when it comes to population, I have and humans, I'd probably, given my current bias would be towards what you mentioned, Hayek, to be thinking, as well as I suppose take inspiration from the way that David Deutsch from Oxford would think about humans, which as universal problem solvers or universal creators. And so I have a fundamentally optimistic view of the human potential, in such a way that it can be harnessed, or if it can be harnessed, because there's so many problems. I suppose my fundamentally optimistic lens to view humanity is that the only thing, and this is inspired by David Deutsch, who wrote this fantastic book, The Beginning of Infinity.
Yeah, I think he's amazing. He's one of the great thinkers as well. David Deutsch is incredible.
I'm so disappointed that he's not more recognized, because his idea.
Very few philosophers are.
Yeah.
As recognized as they should be.
And his book isn't very accessible either. Do you know, like it's a fantastic book, but fuck me, it's proper weightlifting for your brain. Not because
semantics
is particularly difficult, but just because the concepts themselves are they take wrestling with, because they're really a lot of them are
counterintuitive.
Sorry?
They're extremely counterintuitive in the way that he uses words.
Yeah.
He takes words that you would otherwise feel you understand, like knowledge and information, and he does a lot of work with them.
Yeah.
They're absolutely crucial, and it's crucial you understand exactly how he's using those words, because it's not in the folk.
He's not using it in a colloquial manner. He's not using
it.
Yeah. And he's such a powerful thinker, but his kind of idea, it's not even, it's for him, he's the first human I've ever heard come across present this, is basically that, and this is such a fundamentally positive view on the human condition, which is that the only thing, so if something is, essentially the idea goes something along the lines of this, which I might do a bad job of explaining it, but if something is possible by the laws of physics, the only thing stopping humans from doing it is requisite knowledge. So he even has this thought experiment of like, if we can eventually figure out how to do transmutation like occurs when there's exploding stars, then we may very well end up being able to develop like essentially, if I might be doing quite a bad job describing this, but like a giant hydrogen atom hoover in space and suck up hydrogen atoms and make anything we want, because transmutation of hydrogen into other atoms is what takes place in a supernova. So you can make other atoms. So and then as a result become a literal universal creator of any matter that you'd want. And he's got all these thought experiments and potentials in the book. Like, it's outrageous. But the way I kind of see it is, when it comes to humanity, there's so many problems, and this actually genuinely, it irritates me big time. And it's he uses the phrase, he uses the word a lot in the book. He says parochial, which is like, referring to the local,
narrow,
narrow, and it annoys me a lot when you look around the world, man, and I see these countries having war with each other, and these people having conflict over which of their mythologies in the form of some deity that they worship and think to be the creator of the universe or whatever, that they're fighting over this shit, when that's just absurd parochial topics. When you look at the absurdity of the existence of a human, first and foremost, the fact that we are such a in spite of all our knowledge and power, we're such a fragile animal, and there's things like super eruptions from volcanoes that happen every tens of thousands of years apart, depending on the one, like the Toba super eruption in Indonesia, or the Caldera volcano that's underneath Yellowstone National Park. Or you look at rocks that can come from space, like that small asteroid that came in over Chelyabinsk in Russia in 2014 that injured like 1,600 people. But if it had been slightly bigger or come in at a slightly steeper angle and had less time to slow down and less air to slow down through, it could have killed 1,600 or more easily. Or you look at something like the Tunguska event in 1908 or 1912, there was a Tunguska event in Russia. And this fucking comet came in and just flattened like dominoes 2,000 square kilometers of trees. And I looked up the census. When I was looking up that event, I looked up the census for Moscow at the time, and there was like 350,000 people living in Moscow at the time. If that comet had come in over Moscow, everyone's dead. Everyone. But only one fella died because it's fucking Siberia, thankfully. And like you look at these, or you look at the rocks that took out the dinosaurs, and you look at something like solar flares that could wipe out any electrical product on Earth if we had a big enough one. And the last major solar flare was in the 1800s or whatever, and all that happened was some telegraph stations were damaged because there was no fucking electronics, obviously. So you look at all these problems that are facing the very existence, or that are threatening the very existence of humanity itself. That's from like a fear-based perspective, and like what we should be concerned about or worried about. And then you look at things like have we figured out how to create? So that's what, let's say, something that we should be orientating towards is how do we generate solutions to the biggest problems that face our actual ability to even have those absurd parochial conflicts based on what fucking arbitrary nationality or religion your parents happen to give you by birth that you didn't choose. This absurd shit. Like you look at that, I think, okay, what solutions do we need to have to even to be alive, to be able to have those silly parochial arguments? And then as a positive to orientate towards, have we created the most beautiful art imaginable? Have we created the most perfect music? Have we created the best, the most perfect piece of literature, movies? Like there's so much potential there for beauty to orientate towards, as well as and potential there to orientate towards in terms of peak experiences in the human experience, like was it Jordan Greenhall, Jamie Wheel,
Jordan Hall and Jamie Wheel. Okay.
Jamie Wheel talks about peak experiences.
Yeah, flow states.
Flow states, yeah. like these experiences that are just that we've any of us who partake in sport or do any creative stuff, we get glimpses of it, and it just so like, but we haven't figured out how to do that en masse optimally. And we haven't to get those peak experiences, to experience the most profound beauty imaginable or even unimaginable thus far. And we also haven't even figured out how to navigate the very things that could end our ability to solve future problems, like rock from space, volcanic eruptions, climate change, fucking
virus outbreaks.
Virus outbreaks.
worth noting.
We're very much as a class, yeah. I can't believe I even forgot to mention that. But,
biohazards.
So the way I kind of see it is like, imagine you had, let's say, all 7 or 8 billion people on Earth at the moment, whatever there is, and let's say there was a scenario in which none of those people on Earth were worried about food, shelter, water, clean air. None of them were worried about societal instability, political instability. They're not worried about some militia or some fucking some mob coming through, or some town in Africa where these child soldiers are coming through hacking people to bits because they're forced, because they've been taken from their parents and all this kind of shit. Imagine you had 7 whatever billion people on Earth right now, and they could all just contribute to solving problems, not just how to keep us alive in the face of all these things that could easily wipe out our fragile baldy ape meat wagons, but or even just the civilization itself, but even about generating the most beautiful peak experiences, comprehensible and incomprehensible so far. So the way I see it is like, the more minds there are available to solve problems, the better. But
then this is something that often gets missed when a Nick Bostrom or a Sam Harris or Elon Musk even they're talking about Andrew Yang obviously ran on this platform. They're talking about artificial intelligence as it stands in regard to posing a risk, and there's a negative valence to the idea of an AGI, artificial and generalizable intelligence. But even these people recognize and don't get the chance to talk about often enough where that could leave human society if only we were able to capitalize on it. If we were able to actually take advantage of a world in which the menial labor jobs were being undergone by robots and artificial intelligences, it would leave us open to explore these things, acquire that knowledge that David Deutsch talks about in regard to what separates us from being able to land on Mars and survive. It's merely our inability to know how to take the atoms on Mars and transform them into the atoms that we need to live. Like, if you had an atom printer or something that knew how to reassemble the very basic particle structure of something, the only thing that separates us from that ability is the knowledge of how to do it. If 2,000 years ago humanity had all of the knowledge we have now, they'd absolutely be able to build a MacBook. It'd take a while to kick it all up and put it into gear and stuff. But what was separating them wasn't a change in the planet; it was a change in cultural wisdom and knowledge. And so I think I absolutely look to that, and taking it back to where we started in regard to Daniel Schmachtenberger's theorizing that we probably need a natural reduction in population. My bias is also probably more aligned with yours, which is to say, I think the more humans we have, the better. But I suppose his argument really is there's a point at which you can't have more humans and have those humans thriving in such a way that they could think about these things.
Yeah, but I suppose and what the thing about it is that there's going to be moving targets. So given X set of environmental and cultural constraints. And by cultural, I'm including knowledge within that, like knowledge on how to manipulate the environment, knowledge on how to create resources, knowledge on how to produce energy, to recycle, all this stuff. So given X set of constraints, there's going to be a Y amount of people that are going to be able to optimally thrive in terms of what I consider optimal thriving would be the ability to put your cognitive and physical resources towards solving problems.
Have you come across the works of somebody called Andrew McAfee? In particular, I'm thinking of his book More from Less. Have you seen this at all? More from Less.
No.
His whole the thesis of that argument is entirely around the fact that this misnomer that the more people there are, the more advanced we become, the more of a scourge we are on the planet, is just that. It's a misguided notion of our impact on the world, because actually as humans congregate, civilize, urbanize, they inherently and necessarily become far better at deriving more from less. The example he uses, which I think it's an intuition pump in that it just immediately clicks the thing into places. It's not necessarily an intuition pump as Daniel Dennett would define it, but basically his example of, you take the manufacture of a can for a Diet Coke. You take that as an example, and you say, okay, how do you get more from less there? Well, as soon as we developed the technology to do so, we were able to model with computer software how thin you could make that aluminum can. I sound like an American aluminium can.
Okay.
How thin you can make that, and it still be structurally
fit for purpose.
Yeah, exactly this. Where it would be able to hold the drink, not break, not puncture easily. And just how thin can you make it? I think they made it something like 10 times thinner, 10 times less aluminium or something like this, which is just one tiny example of so many things in which this has been the case. Agriculture, you look at agriculture, we are now getting something, so many orders of magnitude more from a certain plot of land than we were before, just because we're better now at deriving more crops from that land. And that's what happens as you build technologies, you congregate, you come together, you build cities, and that cities inherently go through a period of industrialization, emitting much more pollution than would be preferable. But after that, you start to reap the rewards of a space in which humans live that is far more efficient for the planet. Rural areas are actually more, they're more demanding of the natural resources than a city is per person. And so,
Scale is there?
Pardon?
There isn't an economies of scale that's as efficient.
No, exactly. Cities are the most efficient and environmentally positive ways for humans to come together. And so I haven't read the book. I've heard him on 3 different podcasts. I believe Sean Carroll's podcast, Sam Harris's podcast, and I think he might have been on an Intelligence Squared podcast. Can't remember what the third one was. Regardless, it's a fascinating argument, and if it holds up, it gives good cause to be optimistic about our ability to scale down our demands rather than scale them up as we advance further.
Yeah, I like that a lot, man. And it's confirmation bias for me because I've been so.
Me too.
Yeah, it's because I've been so. Yeah, but here's an example of actually a cultural thing. Let's say efficiency. So I was writing about this morning in preparation for another chat I'm going to have, and let's say there's an absurd amount of food wasted in supermarkets. You know,
Yeah.
I think there's this kind of a concept or this idea in marketing where there's this kind of planned, like it's inbuilt into the cost and everything, and is the planned waste, you know.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
imagine if everyone in a society, whatever scale, it doesn't matter. Let's say everyone in a society was educated to know that their brain is going to be that their brain is going to be more positively inclined towards buying stuff from really packed out, filled shelves. Whereas they might only have in their shopping list that they want whatever two 2 kilos of sirloin steak or whatever, right? If they go up to the shelf and there's only 4 or 5 kilos on this massive shelf and it's spread out and it looks kind of sparse and empty, that might not look as appealing to them than if they come around the corner and it's just chock full of beef.
Yeah.
You know, like visually, it's not as attractive for shelves to be kind of sparse and look. And that's a reality that's taken advantage from a marketing perspective. But imagine if people knew that, oh, I wanted beef and that shelf doesn't look like it's very packed, but I still just need to buy X amount of beef. It doesn't matter. Imagine how much less food waste there could be if people were aware of the kind of, I don't know what you call them, like logical. I don't even know what you call them, like
So I suppose they're not quite negative externalities, but they're this outgrowth of the way in which supermarkets have to operate.
yeah,
I think the way you deal with this is the way we've dealt with even. So let's use a contemporary example, the coronavirus. What do you think when you are going for a walk now and somebody's just walking up and they just full steam ahead like a freaking terrorist walking right at you, like a COVID terrorist,
suicide.
suicide bomber? You just think, who's this maniac? Who's this maniac who doesn't just want to observe the niceties or the politeness of just shifting to the left and making sure that we're at least distant enough from each other to feel comfortable. And prior to this, it would have been smoking
Yeah,
in it right next to you. Like, who's this person who's just smoking near me? After what we've learned about passive smoking, why is this occurring? And so, what you have to do is you have to almost build in because disgust is a very strong emotion in humans, and it gets a bad rap, but it can be used for great good. If
yeah,
we could have a disgust for when we see a supermarket packed to a point that we know they can't necessarily sell it all. That there is no sense in which they are going to sell 100 packets of beef that have an expiry date of 2 days from now, and that some of this is going to be thrown away, and that due to over regulation from the government, they can't even give it to farms just to feed their pigs with.
yeah,
So we know it's just going to be thrown away. If that could incite in us a disgust response, that might be the way of fixing this, because culturally that's
mm,
what we've done with so many things that otherwise on a very primitive instinctual level we would be absolutely fine with. There are so many things that instinctively we have no aversion to, but culturally we've
yeah.
created that aversion.
That's a fucking fantastic point, man. 'Cause I wasn't even thinking of it. I hadn't even thought of it in terms of how to actually implement change. I was just thinking of it from like I don't know, kind of a production and waste perspective in terms of how much resources we produce that are only produced as a result of how marketers can best manipulate humans into buying their stuff. And
But ultimately, if they could, they take advantage of our psychology, but
mm,
but at the end of the day, they too would benefit from living in a world in which they didn't have to throw so much food away, because then they could either reap the extra profit of having it priced the same, but not having that, as you called it, sort of that inbuilt waste, or they could reduce the prices and become a much more appealing
mm,
way of buying your meat. And so
mm.
either sense, the marketers are also incentivized to correct this issue. It's just a matter of implementing
Yeah.
the ways of changing our culture such that we would feel more disgusted. You need to almost shove it in people's face that this much food gets thrown away, and sort of have people exposed to just the magnitude of
Yeah.
what is just wasted.
And the amount of food that's wasted, the amount of plastic the amount of animals that are farmed as a result unnecessarily, simply like that are like that you trace all the way back. It's resources
Yeah,
used, it's animals that need to be slaughtered, it's all this stuff, and it's just a lack of and that's and that in itself. So like what I was mentioning earlier on about that X set of cultural norms and knowledge and behaviors and environmental constraints is going to have a Y set of humans that can optimally function within those constraints. And some of those constraints this is in one example of just one of those constraints, which is how much stuff is produced that's not actually directly feeding into human well-being. Obviously, there's people that have jobs that are producing this extra stuff, that are packing extra meat or whatever, a bit of beef in foil or whatever way they're producing it. There's obviously people that have jobs that are in that process, but that's a waste of human potential, given that what they're doing isn't needed from a life-sustaining perspective. Like it's not contributing to innovation. It's not contributing to. So it's like it's a waste of human potential to even have
it's
people
an inefficiency.
Yeah, it's an inefficiency. If you're looking at it from a perspective of if I'm starting out with a fundamental kind of thing of like, how do we behave as a species? So this brings us to the second, and this actually brings us I think to the main component that I found was a massive confirmation bias from Schmachtenberger, and I mentioned
This Dunbar number.
it actually comes down to something that he was hinting towards and elaborate on a little bit was elements of human nature that we can't escape from.
Yeah.
Elements of human nature that we can manipulate.
Yeah.
You know? And I think there's this concept. So if you think about it in perspective of what way do we, so Jordan Peterson has this concept that he talks about a lot. That's his use. He was inspired to create this concept based on another concept by a developmental psychologist called Jean Piaget. And it's this concept called, he refers to it as a Piagetian concentric circle. So a way of kind of explaining it, if I can try, is essentially that, let's say for me as an individual, what's good for me as an individual is only good for me if it's also good for my closest friends and family, in such a way that it's also good for my community, in such a way that it's also good for my nation, in such a way that it's also good for humanity. And then I could add an extra layer on top of that, where I say in such a way that it's also good for the environment in which we have to live, in not just a stable manner, minimum a stable manner, but ideally in an increasingly like improving manner across time.
Yeah.
So that you're, and he calls that this equilibrated state, Piagetian concentric circle, and it ends up being this equilibrated state between the single individual, all of humanity in an increasing outward fashion that gets more and more abstract, to all the way out to the actual environment in which we have to live. So if we take that concept, I think that concept maps onto what Schmachtenberger was referring to at some point when he was talking about, the need for recycling, and he was talking about these inescapable elements of human nature. So like if you think about the constraints on the system that are going to be sustainable across time. And the reason the word utopia is absurd, like you alluded to at the start, is because if you start out with any kind of utopia that's conceived by a human in precise specifics, in terms of we're going to have this structure society, this is going to be
perfect. It will be somebody's hell.
it will be, and also to define it precisely as a fixed thing that we're orientating towards is guilty of absurd epistemic arrogance.
Yeah, so this is something Hayek also talks about when he refers to the evolved extended order of human cooperation, what's otherwise reductively considered to be capitalism and free markets, but is better encapsulated by his word Catallaxy. When he discusses this, he very much talks about the evolved abstract rules and how they are necessarily abstract as opposed to like fixed prescribed notions with precise behaviors and policies. And so it very much speaks to what you're talking about, which is the need for an abstract system in which people can navigate, like we've talked about before, epistemological humility, that the areas in which they think they want to explore without encroaching on other people's space or freedoms or liberties. And so you cannot do that when you say this is exactly how you need to behave and this is fit for everybody. It's not going to work.
Yeah, and we've seen that not working countless times. If you just look at fucking North Korea or Maoist China, Soviet
Union. Even more recently, Venezuela and
Zimbabwe. Also, and you have well with these kind of socialist utopias. And what was the name of that concept by Hayek you mentioned that was something that had to do with the market and capitalism?
Yeah, no, so he calls it the extended order, and he prefers the word Catallaxy over capitalism. Yeah, so it was his attempt in the Fatal Conceit to conceive of a better term than capitalism, because capitalism was a word that was born of a German thinker, I think, and it wasn't necessarily how we referred to the free market until this guy. Well, the use of a mixed economy with free markets and human cooperation. It basically talks to the ability to profit or at least advantage from a system in which each person acts in accordance to the information they have and their own goals, and then by the net outcome is they are cooperating in a system and improving it, because their piece of the puzzle, the information they hold, could not be possibly held by a single mind. Like, if you take each component of it, there is so much distributed information that there is no way to centralize that, and so every person holds their own piece of the puzzle, which fits nicely into the slot. And so they
there's this big project I've been working on. Fuck it, I revived it recently because of the situation that we're in, and I have a bit more time to write and a bit more drive to write this thing in particular. And that fucking concept fits perfect.
You're welcome.
Thing that I'm writing at the moment. That's Jesus Christ, man. That fits fucking perfect. I want to make a little note of that. How do you spell that? Catallaxy.
Yeah, so CATALLAXY.
Right, that is fucking gold. Yes. Right, that's my reading sorted after this anyway, or tomorrow morning before I write. But to get back to that, I really like that, man. To get back to that constraints, right? Fuck, I'm so excited about that now. I didn't know. I was trying to. I had that same concept, but I didn't have a word to describe it. I was thinking of it like essentially like a wisdom of crowds, because I was doing. It's basically got to do with epistemology, and analysing elements of basically the utility of capitalism as regards to epistemic humility, because there's this distributed ability to come up with ideas across a populace and use those ideas to enter the market. You know, so that's fucking awesome, man. I'm delighted that's fucking perfect. I haven't read any Friedrich Hayek at all, so it's all.
He has two very famous books, The Fatal Conceit, and more well known is his The Road to Serfdom. I've read both now. Pardon?
I've heard of the second one, but I never read it.
Yeah, so The Road to Serfdom was written around the time of World War II, and very much coloured by that, but it still resonates now.
Excellent. I'm gonna get into that, man. And so, with regards to this Protopia idea, right? If you think of it in terms of, if you start off with utopia, is obviously a stupid idea, and it's unbelievable. It's guilty of unbelievable epistemic arrogance, because you're automatically saying that you know in advance what a perfect society will look like.
Yeah.
And that's just obviously absurd. So no matter what kind of fucking utopia it is. But this concept of this protopia is the first time I ever heard that word in my life. And even Eric Weinstein in the interview asked Schmachtenberger, what's that mean? Protopia. Like, if fucking Eric Weinstein hasn't heard a word, then I think it's okay for the rest of us to have not heard it either.
Yeah, a bit of humility.
Yeah, it's awesome. But so the thing is like this, right? So there's a concept. So there's two constraints at play that any utopia is going to be limited by, and is ideally going to. I mentioned this to you in a voice message a couple of days ago, that any utopia is going to be limited by, and any utopia is going to have to address, if not align, as closely as possible. So not even any utopia, any movement towards a utopia. So a protopia, movement towards what could be an increasingly perfect situation. And those two constraints are largely going to be, what have humans, specifically humans, because we're the thing that's designing the society. We're the only animal that can design its own zoo. So what limitations or realities are we left with as a result of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of evolutionary selection pressures? Like you say, just since the dawn of time or whatever, what evolutionary pressures have left us with in terms of the legacy in which what we can't get away from, based on our physical limitations, based on the way that we need to cooperate as these social groups, the way that we're so dependent from such a young age, as well as these potential behavioral tendencies that are innate, and bell curve distribution of certain personality traits because it would have been useful in tribal societies and all this kind of stuff. Then there's essentially the two limitations are the evolutionary legacy that we're left with, and the constraints of the environment that we're in, and how those two things can be aligned in such a way that you can have an infinite as opposed to a finite game. You know, because there are going to be ways at which there's elements of a human nature that are potentially going to use up resources at a way faster rate. That's going to make it a much more it's going to make the society of civilization more like a finite game, and then there's going to be ways that will be more like an infinite game. And this isn't even, and so then that straight away, those two constraints automatically remove moral relativism from the equation. Once you start with a fundamental axiom that the existence of human life itself is even a good thing.
Yeah.
So if you start with this premise that the existence of human life, or like we discussed this similar topics this before, let's say conscious life, or whatever, that just keep it human for simplicity for the moment. Because if you start off with that as a fundamental axiom, which is that we're looking at, well, if human life at all is a good thing, then after that, well, if you want to keep human life around, then there needs to be an alignment of the constraints of our evolution legacy with the constraints of the environment in which we have to live, in terms of how we live in that environment, in terms of how we treat the wildlife, how we treat our food resources, energy resources, all that stuff needs to line up, or else we're going to wipe ourselves out. But how to even do that? So there's a concept. So I'm fascinated with the whole period of the Enlightenment, and again, it's something that David Deutsch, to bring it back to him again, talked about, where he talked about essentially he summarized the Enlightenment and he kind of boiled it down to a very simple concept, which is the search for better explanations. Where he essentially said, like, because you look at what the Enlightenment was, it was an abandonment of a higher authority, whether it be the church or religion or aristocracies or whatever, royalty and social standings, as the purveyors or the suppliers of truth. And then you have to kind of look from below and take the truth that's given to you by the religious institutions or the people that are better than you because they're some fucking aristocracy or whatever. It's like it was the abandonment of those, and instead of higher authority or truth by authority, and instead it was a kind of a seeking better explanations from a distributed sense. And that's where what you could look at is what's modern day science came from that. The separation of church and state came from that, in terms of stuff with Magna Carta. Major influences in this, obviously, in the
human liberty.
Yeah, the major influences on this would have been the development of the rule of law, as
America's Constitution was very much sculpted by Enlightenment thinking.
Yeah, and influenced by the Glorious Revolution in England in the 1600s, wasn't it? Where there was the kind of that led to the kind of set things in place for the idea that if a king just wants to go out and kill someone out for no reason, that he's still going to be subject to the same laws that everyone else is, and that he's not just anointed by fucking God, and as a result can do whatever he wants. So the development of rule of law in the West, in the British Enlightenment, and as a result, the British American Constitution massively influenced by what happened in Britain with the separation of church and state and kind of Magna Carta and development of rule of law.
Yeah, the whole European movement.
Yeah. So if you think of it like this, right? So a concept that I was thinking of for a long time, I don't even know how long, months and months, was this idea of enlignment rather than enlightenment. But it's the kind of amalgamation of enlightenment thinking as it relates to perpetually being grounded in epistemic humility and perpetually seeking better explanations, but in a way where you're constantly trying to align the constraints left behind as a result of evolutionary selection pressures on humans and the environment in which we have to live. But how to do so the goal is to be perpetually trying to find better ways of doing it. So that when he mentioned that phrase protopian, that's a clip, because it's the movement. If I was to just add those two things together, then like it would be a kind of a protopian enlignment.
Yeah.
Or enlignment protopian maybe is a better way of putting it. So an enlignment protopian, that we're going to use the enlightenment value of seeking better explanations in such a way that we're perpetually trying to find better ways of learning more about human nature and learning more about how to live in the environment and the constraints that we're in such a way that we can play more of an infinite game and less of a finite game.
I think this is because I have to go now. Unfortunately, I'm still working during this lockdown, and I've got a work hangout. But in regard to this, I think this is something where we need to do a two-parter, because we need to come back and explore Daniel Schmachtenberger's so he has an inchoate concept of how it is that we go about doing this, and obviously recycling plays a huge role. Bits over atoms plays a huge role, because bits are effectively infinite, whereas atoms are finite. And he has an idea of how a cooperative civilization could emerge, not just from working in accordance with it is working in accordance with your own needs, but it's turned around such that you yourself benefit from the other person having access to that which they need to do their best work. Because in a more creative society, I don't like the word society, but in a more creative game, where now we're living in a world where I create and you create, and we're exploring spaces, and we're coming up with novel ideas and all of this. We already have the food we need, the shelter we need, the transport we need. And so it benefits me if you can get access to the studio that you need to do your work, because your work is then inspirational or beneficial to me for the work that I do, and I can sort of feed off of it. And we can, it's Jamie Will has this concept of sort of jamming together, and I hear you, and it's almost like jazz. I hear what you're saying, and I can work within that and play, and we're working together. We're not competing, we're cooperating, but we both want each other to do well, because that helps us to be even better. Something definitely worth exploring when we get back, and you can flesh out your Enlignment concept as well, and how that sort of feeds into it all.
Man. Yeah. I look forward to that. Sounds like you've got some interest. You've got some nice chewy stuff to add to it as well, and to stress test it.
Yeah, no, I look forward to it, man.
Yeah, man. So we'll go again Wednesday.
Yeah, I say next Wednesday, unless something changes.
Nice. 3 p.m. Wednesday.
Yeah, sounds good. So this was recorded 3rd of April, Friday, 2020. That's where we are in this this lockdown, and worth noting it for the record. And hopefully get this out over the weekend. We'll come up with a nice little title, bit punny, a bit, relevant. We'll figure it out.
Nice, excellent. It was an enjoyable chat, man, as always.
Oh, dude, love talking to you. Already looking forward to our next chat, man.
Nice. I must re-listen to that chat with Weinstein over the weekend, and because it seems like
it's a long one. Was it 3 hours?
3 hours, 3.5 hours, something.
Yeah, 3.5 hours. Yeah.
Nice. I'll let you get back to working, man. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the
cool.
And have a nice weekend, buddy.
Yeah, you too. Take care, dude.
Love, man.